These are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar, Employer and Apprentice Experiences with Mobility in Canada. My name is Sean Watson, and I will be your host today. Before we get started, you should now see the title slide on your screen, and just to the right, the webinar control panel. If at any time during the presentation you have a question for our presenter, just type it in the question box and submit. When we get to the end of the presentation, if we have time left, I will ask the questions for you. If we run out of time, we'll follow up directly via email. Efforts to understand and enhance apprentice labor mobility will support apprenticeship completion and help address skills shortages. After today's webinar, you will better understand the experiences of apprentices and employers with relocation across Canada, the barriers to labor mobility, and the supports and solutions. We will draw upon recent CAF research on this topic, where employers who hired outside their jurisdiction and apprentices who relocated were surveyed. I'd now like to turn things over to our lead researcher, Emily Arrowsmith. She will take you through the insights and recommendations resulting from this research. Go ahead, Emily.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sean. So today I'd like to share some of the findings from a recent CAF report that we did on apprentice labor mobility in Canada. So I'd like to briefly discuss the relevance of this issue, provide a very high-level overview of the apprentice labor mobility process to provide context to the findings, and then I'd like to share with you some of the interview, employer, and apprentice findings from the surveys and interviews that we conducted. Just to give you some idea of our approach, we were very wide-reaching in our consultation. We were able to include research participants from 12 jurisdictions to ensure that we obtained insights from across the country. All the employer or apprentice research participants had direct experiences with moving or attempting to move for work. And when the sample sizes were large enough, results were broken down by sector, firm size, apprentice level, and province or region. These breakdowns are important because they allow us to identify what specific groups of employers and apprentices were most impacted by mobility, helping us target future supports. So just to talk a bit about the relevance of apprentice labor mobility, apprentices are in training. So labor mobility legislation does not apply to them because the legislation around mobility typically deals with certified workers. Mobility is a significant issue for apprentices, more so than other post-secondary students, because apprentices are in a work-based program that requires an employer sponsor and is tied to economic cycles. Every apprentice is required to work a specified number of hours in the trade to meet requirements. As junior employees who lack experience and are still learning, apprentices are often the first to be let go at the end of a contract or during an economic downturn, and this leads to gaps in their employment. With an average age for an apprentice that's in the mid-20s, apprentices are often less prepared to deal with these gaps in employment, as they have taken on responsibilities such as mortgages, car payments, and many of them may have families. These discouraging gaps in employment may lead apprentices to pursue employment in other industries or to remain as laborers. They may find it too difficult to accumulate their hours, and they might end up abandoning their apprenticeship programs and not completing. And when apprentices do not complete, they lose the chance to further develop their skills. They lose the benefits that come with certification, such as higher wages, and society loses its investment in the individual's education. Employers in other parts of the country who may be in desperate need of apprentices lose access to these workers. So understanding and thinking about apprentice labor mobility is very significant when we think about the work-based nature of apprenticeship, completion issues, and skill shortages. So in order to provide some context to the interview and survey findings, I'd just like to provide a high-level overview of moving processes for apprentices. So in general, apprentices who wish to move have to find an employer sponsor first. They can move temporarily or permanently. For temporary moves, an application form or a transfer request is usually completed, and it states that, the apprentice will be working for an employer in another jurisdiction. The hours the apprentice works will count as long as the new employer verifies the hours and the task completed. Typically, the apprentice, when they're moving temporarily, must continue to file income tax as a resident in the original province or territory. The apprentice may go back to their original jurisdiction to complete their technical training. Newfoundland and Labrador and New Brunswick, for example, have policies outlining the requirements for apprentices who wish to move temporarily to gain work hours. Another option apprentices have is that they can move permanently. In this scenario, the apprentice has to complete an application in the new jurisdiction. The apprentice must indicate their previous hours, the names of previous employers, education credentials and courses. Transcripts may be required to indicate the completed courses. The information on the application is then verified by the staff, who typically may call the employer or the staff in the original jurisdiction just to confirm the information the apprentice has provided. The logbook may provide additional, may be examined and provide additional insights. Once the staff has done their review of the documents that the apprentice has presented, the apprentice is usually placed at a level that the apprenticeship authority determines. Agreements and policies exist in some provinces to maximize flexibility for employers and apprentices who are trying to move. So that's an overview of current apprentice mobility processes, and this provides an important backdrop to some of the interview and employer and apprentice survey findings that I'm now going to share with you. So as a part of our research project, we talked to 54 apprenticeship stakeholders, mostly jurisdictional officials and apprentices, but we also talked to educators, trainers, and employers as well. Interviewees articulated some of the barriers to apprentice mobility across the country. One of the barriers interviewees talked about was that apprentices often do not understand where the job opportunities are, and as a result they may pursue a trade where there's an oversupply of tradespeople. Interviewees talked about how a better understanding of demand might help apprentices identify trades with available positions in other parts of the country, and access to this information would help address barriers to unemployment. Employers said that they were often unsure about how to connect with apprentices who wanted to move, and said this was a barrier to them hiring apprentices from other jurisdictions. Many interviewees also talked about the lack of awareness around relocation processes. Interviewees expressed concerns that apprentices, educators, and employers do not necessarily know where to go to obtain accurate information about moving. And many interviewees said the process around moving really needs to be demystified, and a lot of the misconceptions need to be addressed. Interviewees also talked about the issues around different sequencing, different logbooks, and different on-the-job competency requirements. Although the content may be similar for the trades, the time devoted to specific content blocks, the sequence, and the year covered varies across different jurisdictions. Distinct regional economies require a mastery of certain areas more than others, but apprentices who are moving to another jurisdiction might not have learned the appropriate material and consequently may be less equipped to work safely and productively on work sites. There's another challenge is there may be a lack of clarity around what level the apprentice is at. You know, some jurisdictions may issue a status card, but it doesn't necessarily say the apprentice's level. The apprenticeship staff may recommend that an apprentice takes an additional course or repeats a level to ensure they understand the content that is required in the new jurisdiction, just to make sure that the apprentice is really familiar with everything that is required. The new employer sponsor may also be asked for input, and he or she may be asked to comment on what skills are required on his or her particular job site, and this also may impact what the apprentice has to do. This process of determining what a level the apprentice is at may cause frustration for the apprentice who has to complete additional technical training or who may not agree with the level that they've been placed at. Apprentices also may not be able to continue their programs if they want to move to a jurisdiction where their trade is not designated or it is designated under another trade name with a different set of criteria and required tasks. So the realities around different requirements in different jurisdictions and different sequencing was a barrier that was noted by a lot of interviewees. Employers said that it is often difficult to recruit tradespeople to remote locations, so that was another barrier they identified. When apprentices move, it is often difficult to keep track of where they are and how they're progressing in their training, so that was noted as another barrier. Many interviewees also talked about the financial burden of moving and the fact that if apprentices have to pay for upgrading or additional courses, this adds to their expenses. So those were some of the key highlights from the interviewee findings. At this point, I'd like to share some of the employer survey results. We talked to 176 employers from across Canada that employed or attempted to employ apprentices from outside their jurisdiction. Some of these apprentices were from other provinces and territories within Canada, and some of the apprentices were from outside the country. Most of the employers who participated in the survey were from Alberta, and a variety of sectors were represented, including construction, mining, manufacturing, transportation, and automotive repair and maintenance. The employer survey was conducted over the telephone by the survey firm Ipsos Reid, and all the survey questions were created in collaboration with a working group of apprenticeship stakeholders. "53% of the employers in the sample were from the construction industry, and the employers who responded to the survey were most likely to hire construction apprentices, including welders, electricians, plumbers, steam fitters, pipe fitters, and heavy-duty equipment mechanics. Medium to large-sized firms participated in the survey, and over half of the employers in the sample had 50 or more employees. Employers were asked about the reasons why they hired from outside their province or territory. A lack of local labor supply was cited by 60% of the employers as the reason they sought apprentices from outside their jurisdiction. 23% said the candidate just happened to be from another province or territory, and 22% of employers said they were looking for specific skill sets. Employers were asked about their preferred apprentice level when hiring from outside their jurisdiction. 38% of employers did prefer apprentices at a particular stage. Upper year apprentices with more technical training and work experience were preferred. 60% of the employers said they had no preference regarding the apprentice level. Employers rated the skill level in their opinion and perception of apprentices who came from other jurisdictions. 72% said the skill levels were the same for apprentices. 22% said the skill levels were lower, and 6% said the skill levels were higher. Employers were asked about whether they experienced barriers to mobility when trying to hire apprentices, and half of the employers said they did experience barriers. Employers in the construction and resource sector were much more likely to experience barriers than employers in other sectors. The survey results also reveal that larger employers are more likely to experience recruitment challenges than those from smaller firms. When asked about the specific barriers they experienced, most employers reported difficulties with the recognition of apprentice technical training or hours. 32% of employers identified these as difficult or somewhat difficult. Obtaining the required records from the apprentice's home province or territory was another challenge that 30% of employers noted. And placing the apprentice at the appropriate level was an additional difficulty for 25% of employers. Ensuring the apprentice had the necessary health and safety training also was another challenge noted by 17% of the employers who participated in the survey. Employers were asked about how they recruit apprentices from other jurisdictions, and the main way employers did this was through direct applications. That was 42%. Online postings was another way. 21% noted they found apprentices through online postings. 17% said word of mouth, and these were the most common methods for identifying apprentices from outside their jurisdiction. As a part of the project, we also did a survey with apprentices, and we talked to 222 apprentices who either reported moving or who had attempted to move for work. 75% of apprentices included in the sample had successfully moved for work outside of their home province. And trying to connect with this specific group of apprentices who had moved, CAF contacted every jurisdiction and invited them to promote the survey to their apprentices. Apprentices who had moved were also identified and emailed individually and invited to complete the survey. All apprentices completed the survey online in either English or French. The results of the survey have been broken down when possible by apprentice level and province or region to understand at a deeper level what groups of apprentices are experiencing barriers. So similar to the employers, most of the apprentices in this sample were from construction. 87% of apprentices were registered in construction-related programs. Most of the apprentices in the sample were working as electricians. That represented 30%. There was carpenters, that was 10%, and steam fitters, pipe fitters, 7%. Most of the apprentices who completed the survey were in their third year or second or fourth year of training. We asked each apprentice what was their province of original registration or their home province, and then we asked them about their destination province. So from this chart, we can see that most of the apprentices were coming either from BC, Ontario, or Newfoundland and Labrador. And the destination province for most of the apprentices was Alberta. 79% of apprentices identified that the destination province was Alberta. This finding makes sense. It reflects interprovincial mobility patterns and the demand for tradespeople due to the strength of the Alberta economy in recent years. When we asked apprentices what factors motivated them to move from home, the most common was employment. They had limited opportunities in their home province and they wanted to move for work. 45% also said they were seeking higher wages. 32% said they wanted career advancement opportunities. And 24% said they wanted to gain hours so that they could complete their apprenticeship. On this question, regional differences were observed. 75% of apprentices from Ontario and 72% of apprentices from the Atlantic provinces said lack of work was a factor. And these were higher percentages than noted for the other provinces and territories. The apprentice year also influenced the responses, with apprentices in their first and third year more likely to cite lack of work than apprentices in their second or fourth year. Apprentices were asked if they experienced barriers to mobility, and 75% of apprentices did say they experienced barriers, and only 25% of apprentices said they did not experience barriers when trying to move for work. So we can see from this slide that a higher percentage of apprentices are experiencing barriers compared to employers. When we asked apprentices about what barriers they experienced, obtaining recognition of training, hours, education, and experience were the barriers most often experienced by apprentices. 30% of apprentices that moved for work felt that their training, hours, education, experience were not recognized or only partially recognized. We did ask apprentices what level they were assessed at. 53% of apprentices said they were assessed at an equivalent level. 37% of apprentices indicated that their training hours, education, and work experience were assessed at a lower level, and 9% said they were assessed at a higher level. Now that's just apprentice perception or reporting of experience, but that's what apprentices told us. There were regional differences on this question. Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba apprentices were most likely to say they were assessed at an equivalent level, followed by British Columbia, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada. Ontario apprentices were the least likely to say they were assessed at an equivalent level. This could be because Ontario has more designated trades than other jurisdictions, perhaps, and maybe it's more difficult to assess equivalencies when the curriculum and training standards are different. Apprentices also reported barriers around cost, and they talked about the financial burden associated with moving. They also talked about the stress of being away from family and friends. Specific other barriers included confusion about the apprenticeship systems across the country and how they worked. Apprentices talked about a lack of community, a lack of supports when moving, language barriers, and the difficulties with finding suitable accommodation. We were able to break down the results further to indicate the specific groups of apprentices that might be experiencing challenges when trying to move. The results show that apprentices who moved without secured employment were more likely to experience barriers than those who already had an employer before they moved. Apprentices that moved permanently were less likely to experience barriers than those who said they were moving on a short-term basis. Apprentices in their fourth year experienced fewer barriers than apprentices in other years. In terms of regional differences, it was noted that apprentices in Ontario were more likely to experience barriers than those in other jurisdictions. Ontario has a larger population and many more people to manage within the system. And unlike Atlantic Canada, where there is a culture of moving, in Ontario there may be less knowledge around moving. As mentioned earlier, there's also maybe barriers around determining the equivalencies for apprentices in Ontario due to the higher number of designated trades. In order to supplement the survey findings and to humanize the data, the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum did talk to apprentices about their perceptions of relocation across the country and their experiences with moving. So I would encourage everyone when they receive the PowerPoint presentation to click on the link and to listen to the interviews with apprentices as they describe their experiences with relocation. The barriers that apprentices discuss in these videos really reflect and confirm the research findings. As a part of the interview process, we talked to stakeholders and we asked them about what supports or recommendations that they might make that would facilitate apprentice mobility across the country. Interviewees included, as I mentioned before, a wide range of apprenticeship stakeholders, but most of them were jurisdictional officials or apprentices themselves, but they also included educators, trainers, employers. The most common suggestion among interviewees was related to harmonization. Interviewees said an aligned curriculum, more common sequencing, and perhaps a common record book or log book would help address some of the barriers around mobility. Continued mobility protocol discussions, harmonization efforts, and continued collaboration among the jurisdictions will hopefully continue to facilitate apprentice mobility. As you may know, there are a number of initiatives underway. Just to give you some high-level examples, the Forum of Labour Market Ministers is working on apprentice mobility protocols. There's the New West Partnership, which is an agreement between British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and they're working towards establishing a single point of contact for apprentices in each jurisdiction to address their mobility barriers. They're also discussing potentially creating some mechanisms such as a central point of contact that may help apprentices who are seeking to move. The apprenticeship authorities in the Atlantic provinces are also exploring potential ways to recognize work hours in other provinces, to better synchronize training, to perhaps align curriculum and improve the consistency in the assessment standards and quality of achievement. The Canadian Council of Directors of Apprenticeship is also overseeing a harmonization initiative. For 10 trades, the Council is exploring better alignment across jurisdictions around work hours, technical training, and sequencing. Interviewees also talked about developing additional online training modules. Interviewees thought that apprentices could perhaps continue their technical training without having to move back to their original jurisdiction by doing online training. Apprentices could also complete any missing content and learn this missing content through online modules while they were still working. And interviewees also put forward the idea that instructors might be engaged to provide apprentices with a few weeks of extra help so they could catch up without necessarily repeating an entire level of the training. Interviewees also talked about better communication around apprentice mobility and the process for moving. Interviewees said that it was important to have centralized, accurate, and up-to-date information. They also talked about perhaps having a central point of contact, such as mobility liaison officers, for example. These officers could be in each province or territory, and they would understand all the requirements across the various jurisdictions, and they could inform apprentices about relocating. While it is acknowledged that the apprenticeship authorities each have their own systems for tracking apprentices, interviewees did think about ways that mobility could perhaps be facilitated through perhaps centralized or more accessible information that could be shared across jurisdictions. Some suggestions that the interviewees made were around perhaps developing a common online logbook that could help apprentices move between jurisdictions and would allow the apprenticeship administrators to see hours, technical training, and education credentials online. Some of the interviewees said that these online logbooks might be easier to update and would perhaps not require as much paperwork by the apprentice or the employer. Interviewees also raised the idea of a central registry perhaps that could be used to track apprentices, although privacy and security concerns would of course have to be addressed. Interviewees felt that there might be some potential benefits. For example, some of the ideas that they shared were apprentices would not need to register every time they changed employers. They could register once and then submit their hours to the common registry. Employers could also perhaps find apprentices who are interested in moving by using this registry. Interviewees also noted that reminders could be sent out to apprentices at various program milestones, and that when they accumulated a specific number of hours or prior to their next level of technical training, a reminder would automatically be sent out. And this perhaps could help the apprentice manage their apprenticeship training better. For apprenticeship administrators, the notion or idea of a central registry, it could be used for them to show available seats in other jurisdictions for technical training. The administrator would then have a better idea of when a school's particular program was full, but they could recommend to the apprentice where the next closest training program might be available. Interviewees also talked about financial and training incentives for apprentices that would encourage them to relocate. Employers were also asked for ideas and suggestions around supports that would help, in their opinion, facilitate apprentice mobility. Employers said that a common apprenticeship system across the country would help facilitate mobility. A company or system to help look for apprentices in and out of the country would also be useful. They talked about the assistance with moving costs, and easier or faster validation of work visa processes was another thing employers noted. So just to conclude, the research confirmed that apprentices and employers do experience barriers to mobility. Approximately 3/4 of apprentices and about half of employers did say they experienced barriers to apprentice mobility. Most of the barriers experienced were around getting hours or technical training recognized. Interviewees felt the #1 barrier was lack of awareness around relocation processes and the different requirements in different jurisdictions. Employers in the construction and resource sector were much more likely to experience barriers than other sectors. Supporting harmonization efforts and better communication about labor mobility processes were common recommendations. So those are some of the key findings from the research project that CAF has done on apprentice labor mobility.
Great, thanks so much, Emily. We do have a few questions, but they're quite research specific, so I think we'll follow up directly with those people after the broadcast. So I'll move into our coming events now. The Canadian Apprenticeship Forum is presenting 3 employer events this November in Halifax, Calgary, and Burnaby. More information about tackling skills shortages in Canada, an apprenticeship-focused approach, can be found on our website. There are also additional sessions in Moncton, New Brunswick, and Prince George, BC, on the business case for hiring and retaining women in the skilled trades. Next up in our webinar series, we're showcasing CAF members who engage in promising youth apprenticeship initiatives. On November 25th, you will hear details of programs that have been designed to encourage youth participation in apprenticeship and skilled trades careers. Success stories and best practices will be shared by representatives from industry, jurisdictional governments, and education. Again, you can find out more and register by going to the news and events page at www.CAF-FCA.org. Today's webinar was recorded and will be sent out to you in a follow-up email in the next couple of days. Thank you all again for joining us, and we look forward to welcoming you at our next event.